Started. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's a thrill to have you for our third Naturehood Gardening webinar in this wonderful series that's exploring our connection to nature through native plants and horticulture, and exploring that through a contemporary lens. And we're thrilled to have an acclaimed photographer with us tonight, Saxon Holt, who's documented gardens for over 2 decades, and whose vision is to use these photographs and storytelling. He's an author, which we'll talk about a new book, to change perceptions about native plants. And you'll see tonight in a series of these beautiful photographs just how beautiful native plants can be in our gardens and in our wildlands. And so we're thrilled to have him tonight to explore climate appropriate plants, and as well as beyond blooms. So thinking about native plants beyond the flowers. Flowers, of course, are gorgeous, as you see here in this photo of a Baja fairy duster, and it looks like a California sunflower and cilia. But there's also things like texture and foliage and fruit. And you can see the leaves of the amazing agave down here in the bottom right, the feathering of that gorgeous grass there. There's so much that we can draw on in the aesthetics of our native garden. And so we'll be talking about that tonight. So I will introduce Saxon officially in just a minute, but before I do, I want to introduce our awesome CNPS horticulture engagement team, and that's Anne Marie and Maya. So hey guys. And I'm David Bryant, the Campaigns and Engagement Manager for the California Native Plant Society. All right, so without further ado, I want to introduce Saxon Holt. I mentioned he's a well-known garden photographer, and he's also an author. So he's out with a new book, Gardening in Summer Dry Climates, Plants for a Lush, Water-Conscious Landscape. And many of the plants in that book are indeed California native. And his photographs really are just sumptuously beautiful and lead us through all types of gardens. And in this book and in other work in his past, he's documented a lot of California native plant gardens in gorgeous detail. And we're gonna see some of those later on. And be able to kind of understand some plants and design elements that can transcend flowers. We love flowers, they're gorgeous, but there's also other things that make native plants beautiful. And so I'm going to pass it over to Saxon to provide an introductory keynote to our webinar tonight.
Well, great. Thanks, David. It's really nice to be here. I'm going to start with my background where I am. I am here in Marin County, and it's interesting sometimes when people from out of state don't really know where that is and ask where I live, and say, well, it's sort of San Francisco, and they'll say, oh, San Francisco. So you garden as if you're in San Francisco, and anyone who knows anything about the area knows so many different microclimates. I like to say San Francisco is a subtropical cloud forest. I mean, it's so different from where I live in the oak woodlands of Marin County, which is much closer to Sonoma or even the Central Valley than San Francisco. And but it's something we all have to learn. It's really the message. If you're a gardener, you must learn what it is, what climate you're in, and how you make it work for yourself. I think my message really is about learning to be a gardener in this climate and doing everything you can. I think we have responsibility in these days to do what we can for the climate. Gardeners know that's actually a lot of fun. And the more we do it together, the more we're going to really add resiliency, I think, to the overall planet. I think a successful gardener here, as anywhere, has to work with the climate, not conquer it. First, you have to learn to appreciate the climate and the aesthetic from where it comes. You have to get out in it. Hiking and camping is what I like to do. It's not really a Mediterranean climate. It's Californian. It's summer dry, and all of it's really beautiful. The book is part of the Summer Dry Project. We are also working with the state of California's WUCL's database, which is a water classification system for calculating water use. We have a Summer Dry website and an Instagram account, which is sort of fun to follow because there are people all over the world who are following the Summer Dry Instagram account. The book is really just a tool. It's not really a academic study of climates or design. It's a tool. It's about plants. It's about climate-driven plant choices that are key to successful gardening in our ecologically diverse summer dry West Coast. there'll be a chance to order it later. But what I really want to bring home is that every garden is different. Every garden must match your ecosystem. I really like the work of Doug Tallamy. Many of you may know an entomologist who lectures on ecology and gardening. And I love this quote from his recent book called Nature's Best Hope. It's tempting to garden for beauty without regarding the many ecological roles our landscapes must perform. And it's not difficult to do the right thing. And it's our responsibility to think about how the climate works and how our gardens can work with the climate. I want to give a little background of climate, especially about vegetation zones. We often see biomes. Biomes are classifications that also include the wildlife. These Köppen vegetation zones have divided the whole world up into these vegetation zones. There's often subdivided into zones based on water use and temperatures, which separates every zone to itself. There are 5 summer dry zones in the world. Often they're called Mediterranean, and Mediterranean I think is a well understood term, and it's somewhat limiting when you start thinking about summer dry. If you see here, the summer dry is not just S for summer dry, it's also how cold it is and how wet it gets. In the West Coast, for our new book, we considered the whole West Coast as a summer dry climate. Part of that is certainly Mediterranean, but it's not really Mediterranean if you get up to Portland and Seattle, but they do have summer dry climates and increasingly dry. So it's the book's focus is about the whole West Coast. And I think David mentioned earlier that we have about, but I think about 40% of the book is native plants. It's not the whole book, but it's surprising how much of this book is native plants. So we're really pleased about that. We start with those Köppen vegetation maps. They start drilling down to ecotopes. It's how we define our local climates. We can drill ecotopes down even farther into ecotones and even microclimates, which is how we really need to study our own local climate and our own identity of where we are gardening. In the book, we basically divided the West Coast into 4 zones. You see, and for each one, we chose a native habitat where really we all must cue our gardening ideas from the native habitat. So in the lower left, we chose Torrey Pine State Park. That's to represent California coastal chaparral, coastal scrub. In the upper right, that's Carrizo Plain, and that would recommend more Central Valley and hot. The lower left is where I live in Northern California, and the lower right represent the Northwest, and that's a native native preserve in Portland called the Camassia Preserve there with its native oaks and Camassias. It's really hard to try to pick one iconic photograph for each of the zones, but for Southern California, I don't think people realize how beautiful the native habitat is. It's been so paved over and developed, especially near the coast. And Torrey Pine State Park is really an excellent example of the persistence of vegetation and how beautiful it can be in its own native habitat. I hope most of you have been to Carrizo Plains when it's been at full bloom and just marvel at the rows and rows of mountain ranges. In the summer, obviously, it's really, really hot, but when you learn to garden with it, there are lots of things you can do. Here again is my native habitat on Mount Burdell State Park in Novato. There's a flowering buckeye on the hill in the midsummer. It's actually, buckeyes, as many of you may know, lose their leaves by late summer. They're summer deciduous, but that's part of their glory, really, the beauty and the structure of the deciduous trees you can see in the late summer. And again, here's that Camassia State Park outside of Portland that represents the native Oregon oaks and their Camassias and native. So once we start thinking about the larger ecotopes and we start thinking about the smaller areas that we want to think about our own gardens, we think of them as niche truths. And I get that from Obi Kaufman. I hope all of you know Obi Kaufman. It's a fantastic author, writer, who has written that My work operates in what we call the post-environmental world. And I actually can't, I was going to read this directly from it. I can't read my screen, David. So I got it over here.
I can read it for you. Do you want me to read this
I
quote?
found it again. I got it. My work operates in what can be called a post-environmentalist world, where the arguments for pure logic are over. And we've moved on from merely toiling to prevent degradation to now greater visions wrapped up in better stories of how we mitigate catastrophe. Two opposing truths are relevant. One, the amount of biodiversity still extant is a miracle. And two, we're already in the bottleneck of cascading effects toward a permanently altered biosphere. In my only daily practice of making sprawling books of California nature, I aim to the discourse of this big picture stuff, all the while concentrating on the smallest geographically specific niche truths upon which the living world relies. And that's absolutely what gardeners need to do. Concentrate on the smallest geographically specific niche truths, because that's what the gardens are. You take these larger truths from the ecotopes in the native habitats, and you take that down to gardens. And each garden needs to be specifically adapted to that exact location in a very small niche truth. I just love the way Obi Kaufman says that. I hope all of you know his work. He has 3 field guides out now. His latest one is the Forest of California. He's an artist and a deep thinker. I almost hate to say it, but I think if he's around long enough, he'll be like the next John Muir. He is so influential and so perceptive. You should check him out if you don't know his work. But so here we have 4 gardens that represent, again, the 4 ecologicals, ecotopes, the larger zones. This is southern coastal California. You can't quite see, but in the distance, there's ocean. These are native carex, grass, lawn replacement. Here's a wonderful dry stack wall that weaves its way out to see the Central Valley mountains in the distance. These are not all native plants, obviously. The book is from all the summer dry climates of the world, but this is iconic of way to use the stone and the rocks to tie into the native landscape. This is the garden in Northern California. One of my favorite gardens for the book because it's so mature. The red bark trees are Arbutus marina. It's not a native. Native Arbutus are really hard to grow, and I would not recommend anyone try it unless you have mycorrhizal soil adaptation. But if you love the look, you can get these ornamental madrones, and seeing how mature they are, it just shows a really good adaptation to the local climate. And this is a garden in the Northwest. It's not a garden we would consider low water use in certainly not Southern California, but it is this is in Seattle. But with grasses and onions and berberis, these are all plants that really do well if you know how to choose them. And that's really part of the art of gardening, is understanding your climate and choosing plants that work with it. I'll go back to the whole concept of vegetation. We saw in that Köppen map the 5 summer dry regions, which are the ecotope for summer dry, or sometimes called Mediterranean. It's a really nice, succinct description of it, the smallest ecologically distinct feature in a landscape and mapping classification system. So again, we're drilling down to what a garden is, a smaller system, and here an ecotope, the smallest ecologically distinct landscape feature. We need to start thinking exactly how that works. And from an ecotope, which is rather a larger area, an ecotone, which is a wonderful term, as you can see here, from Greek, eco meaning house, and tone for tension. A border zone where ecological systems meet and mingle, sometimes forming new communities. So that's, in nature, those are ecotones. But if we're creating a garden, isn't that what we do with gardens? We form new communities. We put things together in new communities. This is a fantastic garden. This is the garden of David Frost, who owns Native Sons Nursery. It's a very mature garden with native oaks and grasses, not all native. He has you see a cotinus on the left side and various grasses that are not quite native, but the concept is understanding your local habitats, your ecotones, and working with it. So your garden reflects nature. So we've mentioned these 4 things already. What the ecotope is, it's a small ecologically distinct landscape feature, an ecotone, where small systems create new communities. Where Kaufman talks about the niche truths of what the world relies. We talked about every small act we do adds resiliency. I'm going to add another thing from Doug Tallamy, what gardens can be. Gardens can be a cure. They will require small efforts by many people, but that will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to all. That's the human interface. That's what we need to be doing, is working with gardens. Everything we can do with a garden can add some resiliency. I'm going to go through really quickly at this point. I've got these 4 particular slides represent 4 basic features in the book. The upper left is how to choose plants, and the right side is firescaping and open space. The left is water and hydrozones, and the right is biodiversity and carbon sequestration. But one of the most important to me, I think we must understand, is how to use water and recycle our water. Here's a bioswale at UC Davis that's been used to collect water off the parking lot, which is why I included the car in the photograph, to make sure we understand that this is really a way to clean water and help it percolate back into the ground. As part of the green infrastructures is something that I think we're going to be hearing more and more about, not just in a theory, especially with hopefully this new administration and getting back more onto talking about climate and what we can do. Green infrastructure is a solid way to take care of the earth and provide jobs for people. I'll mention real quickly that the other water features that I really think are important. In the upper right, we see a cistern system being collected in a backyard garden. The roof is higher than the cistern, so it's fed by pure gravity. I would argue that when we collect water from rain barrels or cisterns, we should use it in the winter when we need it. Sometimes if you have a large system like this one, you can save it till the summer, perhaps, but oftentimes our plants need the water now and in the winter. So if you collect water from a storm and it doesn't rain for a couple of weeks, use that water. That's when the plants need it. The lower right is a rooftop rain garden. The water is collected off the roof, percolates through the gutter to a rain garden in the front, and then it percolates back into the soil, which is, I hope we all understand how important it is to get the water back into the soil. And gardeners can make that happen. If the water just runs into storm drains and off the land, it doesn't help the groundwater. It doesn't help the more permanent trees and shrubs. So it's vital, I think, that we use rain gardens. And I think going forward, there's some proposals in the state that require new developments, maybe not individual homes, but new developments to have all water stay on the site through various percolation and collection methods. And in the lower left is just a simple picture of a new irrigation system going in. Our book is not sometimes been misunderstood as a no summer water garden. We think summer water is important for hydrating. A lot of plants need water in their first couple of years anyway, native plant or not. And it's just a way to maintain lushness around our homes. There's a lot of arguments about how much water homeowners, gardens should use versus how much water we capture as a society. There was a statistic a few years ago that made it seem like 44% of all urban water was used for gardens was a major problem. And for me, that's not a major problem when you think that of that 44% that urban users get, 90% goes to farms. So if you get 44% of 10%, that's not that much water. We can argue about how much gardens should get, but they need to get some. It was just a tragedy years ago when the last drought, when so many trees died in Los Angeles because people thought they shouldn't water at all. So it's a trick. It's a skill we have to learn when we want to learn how to garden, what water to add. And again, that's really why I did the book, to give choices of plants and what zones they're work in and how to work with them. Back to the other features, we'll talk about firescaping just real quickly. It's only mentioned briefly in the book, but the idea of keeping plants hydrated and plants not too close to the house. We use this garden, which I didn't even realize it when we chose it. It's a native plant garden. We chose this to show biodiversity and carbon sequestration. It's really important that gardeners understand our role in putting carbon back in the soil, how plants can do that. There's also a great garden to show how you layer a garden for height, for biodiversity. We could do a whole talk on that one garden. And there's a section about choosing plants, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. How to choose plants, how to get their size, which plants are adapted. Here's the ones I chose for this little presentation are all native plants. The native coffeeberry frangularia is in a small garden in Oakland. When you notice that it can be pruned up to have light underneath it, and pruned for shape, which is often an ornamental effect. This photo, I think David and the group chose to talk about it later in the presentation, but I was so struck by it. It's in Long Beach. When I saw this silver foliage Atroplex, a salt bush, I was almost started laughing. It was just so wonderful to see this gray foliage in the midst of this native garden. Of course, the daffodils are not native, but there's native ceanothus and other shrubs along this path. Another thing to learn, what we need to understand with books and references is that there are certain selections of plants that are more adapted to home use. Here, our native flannel bush from Montedendron. This is a selection called Ken Taylor. It's a small one that's prostrate, and it stays small, and it's here scrambling over a rock. So it's a matter of learning which plants can be used in which kind of sites. I hope anyone who has a native plant garden should have some sort of manzanita. There's so many adapted to every climate across California. There are just dozens and dozens of really good ones. But what's so wonderful about them is how they can be limbed up, and you can see through them in the wonderful structure. So they don't really take up that much room here in a patio next to a swimming pool, but it provides fantastic shapes. And this ceanothus, this is one at UC Davis called Valley Violet, I think. It's one that's really adapted to the Central Valley because it takes the hot heat. I've been really going to Davis a lot. Their ornamental horticulture program is fantastic. Has great ideas, and I know if something's growing there in the Central Valley, it's pretty good bet. It has broad appeal. Maybe not in Palm Springs and maybe not in Eureka, but still the testing grounds at Davis are just wonderful. And this ceanothus, again, is you need to learn which ones are best for where you are. Then we're going to back out now just to talk about, again, this is my home grounds here. I think we need to think about the earth as our own garden and how we take care of her. As a quick, review of the things the Summer Drive Project is involved with. Now the last slide I have here just will show, I think, a contact. Yeah, I think you can get the book at the Summer Drive website. There's a click for it on the top of the homepage, and it is fun to follow the Instagram account because there are really people all over the world who are following it, and it's really fun to see what's happening in southern France or in Western Australia, and it's not really geared toward native plant enthusiasts, but I think it's really a fun site. But I think David and the crew here have other photos for us to look at, and we can talk about the way it worked, folks. Is doing this presentation, the CNPS folks said we want to pick some pictures that we think their audience would like to talk about and we'd like to talk about. So I sent about, I don't know, 40 pictures or so, and we got it down to 15 or something that we're going to show after I stop my screen share and talk about the individual gardens. As a photographer, I am happy to talk about how things were shot, but I'm more interested in the plants, the locations, and how the gardeners put them together. I'm blessed that I can get into good gardens, but I can't take a good garden picture unless it's a good garden. And it's really my job, I think, being in the media to try to change the aesthetic of what people see in a garden. It's not just the lawns and the English style garden, which is great if you're in England, but that model is not what we should be doing. And it's really my job to show something different that people will see as beautiful, and rethink what beauty is. Beauty is important for all, as I say in this quote, we need to be stewards of the land on behalf of all creatures. And that's what beauty is all about. So David, I'm going to stop my screen share and get
Beautiful.
back to you.
That was fabulous.
Yeah.
So before we go into more of Saxon's images, I just want to ask Maya, are there any questions at this stage that we might want to throw a Saxon's way, or just for the team?
No, there hasn't been any questions that are related to.
Okay,
well,
beautiful.
there's one that just popped up. Okay, yeah, now we're good.
Well, there's a second question, 2 in a row on clay soils with manzanitas, and most of those you can look at calscape.org and find your area, what manzanita will work. There's some really great ones there.
Yeah, I answered it with that exact answer. So yeah.
I had a question. That question's come up twice with people in audiences I've given the presentation to about clay soil. They say, oh, I've got clay soil. What do I do? And I say, congratulations. That's what I have. I have clay soil, and clay holds water. It's really great for holding water. You have to mulch it and add some compost, and the soil structure will change somewhat. But if you have clay, I think it's a blessing to have deep-rooted shrubs. Where I am, my garden is heavy with native shrubs, and I have lots of trees. They wouldn't live here without the natural clay soil.
Awesome. All right, so we thought it fitting to begin with a photograph of I guess you could say, wild garden, and this is a Saxon Holt photograph, and I think it's Anza Borrego, right? Saxon is
right. Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
And so, kind of going off of that notion that it's garden earth, and that we're looking to our natural spaces in ecotones for inspiration. So we're going to go through these images of gardens, and we just want it to be a friendly discussion. And with Anne-Marie and Maya here, both horticultural experts in native plants, we'll try to tease out some conversations about seasonal beauty and aesthetics beyond just flowers. Of course, we probably will nod at the flowers too, because they're so gorgeous. But we want to give you a sense of other things you can be looking for in terms of beauty in a native garden. So Saxon, do you want to introduce us to this beautiful garden here?
Well, I'll give you a little background to it, but I would love to field questions from you guys. What I loved about this garden is a front yard, and you can see there's a sidewalk behind it. So it's what sometimes called a hell strip. And one of my favorite native plants is the Cleveland sage. They're growing right there in the foreground. So as you walk along the sidewalk, at the height of summer, you have to run into this thing. So you have to be a part of it. And there's a Muhlenbergia grass. There's a buckeye tree behind it. It's quite a mix. It's a small urban garden, which I think is wonderful to see. I like to think of it as an oasis. I think that's back to the responsibility we all have as gardeners to connect the earth to our urban suburban matrix. Every garden helps, and a little garden can help a lot more than you realize, especially if they're done in concert with neighbors and other people are doing the same thing. The urban oasis, the wildlife corridors, this is what it looks like, and I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
I think that's a fragrant pitcher sage in the Lepicinia fragrans.
Yes.
I love that. That's an evergreen. That's a perennial evergreen, and the leaves are insanely aromatic. But I also love that kind of silver tint to that plant. Yeah,
that again, part of the craft of gardening is getting plants that have different foliage colors, because it's not going to be flowering all the time. Actually, I think Cleveland sage looks great in the summer, even after it stops flowering. It has these little pagoda-like flower blossoms. But choosing silver foliage is really a key thing to do in any native plant garden, I think.
Well, this throws out kind of all the rules that you probably see up and down the street there of having, a parking strip, the sidewalk, a lawn with a single tree, and then some flowers in the front that we see so often particularly in some of those, very small yards. They've made it into a lush area that uses a lot of different color, a lot of texture, a lot of heights, and it looks like also a lot of different flowering seasons.
Yeah, that's true. It's beautiful.
Where exactly is this garden?
El Cerrito.
El Cerrito. Okay, great. someone asked
There's
about.
I saw this, there's a native plant tour every year, the Bring Back the Natives tour in the East
Oh,
Bay,
yeah.
that I think every garden in it has to have at least 50% native, but they're almost always at least 70 or 80% native plants. And this is one that I found on that tour. I've worked with them. Kathy Kramer runs that. And so I try to help them out sometimes.
We are coming up on the next few months. It'll be tour time, and
I hope so.
there's going to be some beautiful, beautiful tours out there. This one did take a lot of interesting mixing, though. It looks almost like you have to walk through and into it. Oh,
And a completely different, this is so,
Yeah.
seems about architecture and structure in the plant.
Yeah, the Ocotillo is such an architectural plant, and you just have, it's not for every garden. It has to be, this is San Diego. And so the garden works well there. You couldn't plant this in Northern California. I don't think it would. I've never seen one actually in Northern California. He's not successful. And this is a front yard garden. And it's facing, I'm standing on the sidewalk looking at the garden. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the cactus, but they're all native plants, and it's just a lovely mix. And I think it fits the architecture. You notice the house is painted that steely blue, and that works well with all sorts of grays and the rocks. I know the garden designer does all native plants. Dave, I can't remember his last name. He's in San Diego, does fantastic native plant gardens and source the rocks locally. So so it looks like it belongs there. Although this garden is in a typical suburban neighborhood, there are no other rocks like this around the other houses. It's just this particular house was landscaped to bring the native habitat to the owner.
This has a couple of things that would help when it goes drier in the summer in areas that aren't going to have flowers at that moment. You've got a lot of different structure, and you've got some color in the barks as well to help keep it clean looking and have some pops even when you don't have a lot flowering at that moment.
Yeah, that's a great point. That Palo Verde has a green bark and actually photosynthesizes through the bark. So that's kind of a cool thing to think about. There's a couple, Manzanita, we just saw examples with that burgundy color. So you can be looking at bark and the actual structure of the tree itself to provide some color when other things might be dormant or a little bit rusty.
And I think, isn't the shrubby, is it Encilia?
I think so. I was going to say that.
Yeah.
I think it's Celia Ferrugosa. Yeah.
That's what my notes say, but it must have gotten some extra water, but it's still, I love the foliage of it. It's a really nice complement.
Yeah, and my experience in Southern California with that plant is you give it a little bit of extra water and it stays really gorgeously lush like that. It's used to low precipitation in the desert and inland areas of SoCal, but in our gardens, just with a little bit of extra water, you can get that plump, beautiful kind of silver foliage. How do you know, I mean, Ocotillo does go deciduous, but I think that's kind of a good conversation about maybe the interplay of like, what are you, in your experiences designing gardens or photographing gardens, Saxon, like how can you kind of accommodate deciduous plants with evergreen plants? What are some considerations for that?
Well, that's always the art gardening, and that's up to the gardeners. Most cases, some cases you see it doesn't work at all. And other times it's just right. There's another photo coming up later. We'll talk about how things were just right. I will say there are several Ocotillos, and so I think it's also a matter of choosing which one can be adapted to which site. But I think it's important, especially in a more or less a desert environment, to have these plants that have structure. What's interesting to me, as I'm actually reflecting on this right now, is there are no grasses in this particular vignette. And I always think of grasses as being so important to summer dry gardens. But these folks didn't choose any, which is interesting. I think that works great with the deciduous plants. I mentioned in my presentation that buckeyes go deciduous, and these Ocotillos, even when they're flowering, they're stark. They're not that strongly in flower. The flowers are great for the native hummingbirds and the wildlife, but they're not a strong feature of the garden. You really grow them for the shape, and if you want to put one strategically, I think it's the kind of thing as a gardener, you pick your places. You want to site it very carefully. Even by making a map, I wouldn't want to go to a, have it in my heart, I had to have an ocotillo and then show up at a native plant sale and buy one without knowing where I was going to put it. Because A, it might not survive, but B, if it's in the wrong place, too close to a house or too shrubby, it would be wasted.
Yeah, good point. Totally different change of scenery here. Do you want to give us a quick tour, Saxon, or a description of the?
Yeah, this is one of my. I'm sorry, I'm doing a disservice to all the designers and owners of these gardens, and I should have refreshed my memory. This is Pasadena. You can see the house behind. There's a large native oak that the folks inherited in this site, and so the house is behind that. And this is from the house headed toward the street. It's almost all native plants. I think there's a few plants in this garden that are not native. This vignette, I think, are all natives. And it's wonderful that plays off the oak behind it, which is that dark shape, which makes the red bud really stand out. The red bud is one of our native. It's a great native tree. Small, it's great because it stays small. Takes very little summer water, and they have these fantastic magenta, pink magenta flowers that obviously are fantastic in the spring. But I like the red buds for the leaves. The leaves are almost heart shaped, and they like poplars. They almost dangle in the wind. If you're in the garden, when you have a red bud, it's just it's glorious. On the right, I think is a buckeye tree that's already leafed out, but I don't think it's flowered yet. And the front, I don't know exactly that shrubby thing. I do know the man's an artist, and so he has some of his sculptures and things in the garden. I wish I could remember his name because he's now designing native plant gardens in Los Angeles area. I might be able to find it in my notes over here. Oh, Andreas Hessing, do you guys know that name? Andreas? Anyway, this is his house, and he's now designing gardens.
When he used art in his garden to pick up some of the colors you're seeing in the various plants around it, and kind of mimic he's got the curvature of his art with a curved walkway.
Oh, right. Yeah. And you know, there's a rock also in the foreground. I think it's my point of view is looking past the rock into the garden, but the rock is something that really helps anchor the front of the garden. And the pathway wanders as you're looking at it. His driveway is on the left, and so that pathway would wander in front of that rock and curve around to the driveway. But
I love all the different kind of types of leaves here. There's actually so much diversity in leaf shape, and you go from the big buckeye leaves, which are leafing out on the right, to smaller dark oak leaves, the heart-shaped redbud leaves you're talking about, and then down to those right below the redbud. It looks like a bunch of succulent dudleias, which of course,
good eye. Yes.
So I mean, even if you stripped away all the flowers, there'd be such a diversity of leaves that I think keeps the eye interested and engaged in the shot.
Yeah.
And this is, you said in the LA area, is it in Altadena?
Pasadena, or maybe Altadena. Altadena might be closer. I think it might be. Yeah, I remember I was on a shoot a few years ago in that area, and I got various Altadena, Pasadena areas mixed up. It's there are a lot of little towns in Southern California, and I'm probably embarrassing myself by getting them mixed up. But I'm a Northern California resident.
Well, LA is a megalopolis area. There are a lot of towns that are easy to run in. They're in the same zones together.
Yeah.
But this is during a summer or late spring in the garden. It looks like everything's. So this is a version of a dry summer garden or summer dry garden.
Yeah. Well, as you know, the redbuds are late spring. You know, I find, I mentioned earlier, in my own garden, I take more satisfaction in my shrubs than I do in my annuals and perennials, because they're the backbones, but they tend to bloom later. And but I don't know, I could probably find out. I don't think it's, my recollection, this is probably May. I don't think it's much later than that. I don't think the redbud would delay that much more The
The late
Buckeyes
spring.
come out early. Buckeyes are often early. And so I don't remember exactly, but it's clearly, as David pointed out, there's so much going on, so many different textures and uh, heights going on. It's important. I mentioned earlier that we talked in the book, we talked very briefly about carbon sequestration and biodiversity and gardens that are complex, that have different heights into them, and the ground is covered. David pointed out the Dudleys under the redwood. Every part of the ground is covered. That provides, moisture retention, but also homes for all the little critters and birds and insects that need habitat. Open ground is just not what we want our gardens to have. There needs to be something covering them almost all the time.
You
That's
had mentioned
great.
over the.
I just want to give maybe a moment for anybody's quick questions by, and then we'll start sailing through.
What is the white flowering shrub on the bottom right? I cannot tell. Just looking at that photo.
There's a rock. There's a rock. I'm looking over a rock, that gray.
But to
Well,
the right of
behind the rock. Yeah, behind the.
I think I don't know the scientific name. I think it's called mountain misery or southern mountain.
Oh,
misery.
it is. Okay.
Yeah, has that kind of fern shaped leaf.
Yeah, it has a distinct smell. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, really resiny. Yeah. Okay. Oh
That's
my
it.
God, this is gorgeous.
Yeah. This is a very, very special garden. And to me, it's way satisfying. The folks are obviously very wealthy to either both own this spot and to have built this house and to have moved the trees here. These trees are not native. They were moved. The homeowner loved native plants. And this house overlooks the ocean in Carpinteria. And the building code didn't allow him to build, to both see the ocean and build further away from it, where he would have been in the oak woodlands. So he was wealthy enough to bring these oak trees in, and he sited them himself from the house. So he has a really nice balance of where they are. But it was really satisfying to me to see a person of this means to make this effort to go native. There are a lot of people who are environmentalists and ecologists and want to do the right thing in their own little small yards, but too often the folks with a lot of means, they want things that are more almost English looking. They want to defy nature. They want to prove they're masters over it rather than work with it. So this is one of my favorite gardens just because of the commitment I know the owners have, and they designed it not by themselves, but very hands-on. And as I said, sited the oaks to where they would be. The lawn replacement is Carex panza, which stretches out from the house down to a steep hill. Close to the house, I know there's some ceanothus and prostrate Arctostaphylos. I don't remember what they are. Behind this little patio, you can see there's a little bit of a pond, a wet spot. And so they've evoked that with some sedges, and I think that's irises behind it. But it's just very satisfying to me to it's one, to be nice to be able in this garden, which is totally private and totally native plants. But it's satisfying, I say, to see what the folks did with it.
Looks like they obviously spend a lot of time out here enjoying it.
Yes, yeah, I can't say their names, but I know they're very devoted to native plants and the outdoors.
Well, and re-oaking a lot of areas is an important thing for California in general. Oaks are one of our biggest homes for biodiversity. I think Doug Tallamy lists something like 200 species that need oaks in their lives. It's
Oaks are the single. If I had, the first plant I would plant, to advise to anyone, is to plant an oak. If you have the space, obviously they get big. You don't want them hanging over the roofs if you have a small urban garden. But if you have the space at all where you can maintain it and keep the roots, the branches off your roof, I just love them. I have a lot of oaks on my property, so that's my reason. I think we bought it because we loved all the oaks. And I think we know now if they're hydrated and they're well tended, they're not any tree is going to get sucked up in a firestorm, but they're not as fire hazard as some other non-native trees. And as you said, Anne-Marie, the ecosystem services that oak tree offers is, I think, number one on Doug Tallamy's chart. There's nothing quite like an oak tree.
And there are a lot of really good oak trees out there that it can be specific to the area. You can find them through Calscape by putting in your spot. But oaks are, we have Oakland, we have Thousand Oaks, all these towns named after them that hardly have oaks left. So maybe it's time to look more into those.
Yeah, it's so true. I love here the intentionality of like pruning the manzanitas so that you get to see that understory of grasses, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea here, is to showcase the frame, the architecture of the manzanita branches.
Yeah, this is actually a garden that I did not photograph for the book. It's an older garden that I when you guys asked for all the native plant gardens, our selection, I chose this one. It's our garden of Phil Van Solen, who owns Cal Flora Nursery, and who hopefully many of you know, in Northern California. Is that nursery is 35 years old or something. I think Phil is retiring, but and I shot this for a book I did years ago on Meadows, American Meadow Garden, and for lawn replacement. This is his front yard. The melic grasses and fescues beneath the sort of twisted manzanitas, which Phil would probably say, "Oh, well, you shouldn't show that angle. That's not the most healthiest, manzanita." But that's what happens with them when they get older. Their branches stay as beautiful architectural statements. And this garden, you can't. I'll tell you, we can't really tell because it's so lush with the grasses. There's a swale. I'm looking just over the swale. In the right-hand side, you see a fern sticking out. There's a little, almost like a ditch that Phil made or created. There might have been a riparian habitat on that property at some point, but it's a relatively small property in Sebastopol. I think he's actually moved out of that property now, but it was started years ago that he did as a lawn replacement, and so I love native grasses, so I was very attracted to this garden.
And this does a couple of the things you talked about. This has all of the ground covered, all the soil covered and used really well. It has trees that were obviously started being pruned early, which will help with their long-term health. You've got really good grasses of a whole variety of types. You've got good water containment on there. What are the little yellow flowers that are a little bit harder to see here?
Oh gosh, Limnanthus maybe. I can't. It looks. I don't remember exactly. I think they're actually not. They're the same plant as in the left, in the back. I think those are meadowfoams, aren't they? The Limnanthus in the back left there.
It looks likely they're just kind of just hidden enough that it's tough, but there's such a nice little pop of color in the front and a nice background in the back there.
Yeah, this garden was old enough, as you commented on, that things can start seeding around and come up, and so it's interesting. As you mentioned, the grasses. I talked to an entomologist years ago when I did one of my grass books about the benefits of bunch grasses and how many insects overwinter in the bunch grasses, and how important they are for just their livelihoods, not just their feeding or pollination. Their homes. They live deep inside the bunch grasses.
Wow.
And with that, we also have, a little bit better IPM perhaps for some of the digging critters.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to ignore the flowers. I know this talk is beyond blooms, but
Yeah.
the flowers are gorgeous here. Lots of beautiful color. I mean, if you had to, I mean, the monkey flowers here, the bush monkey flowers, which you see in all these different cultivars, I think these are maybe part of the jelly bean varieties that are out there.
Oh yeah.
But a
lot of those, yeah.
I love these because I know from experience that they bloom so much if you keep them watered. These monkey flowers can be adding color to your yard pretty often.
Well, and one of the things with the potential for summer dry gardens is in a lot of places they can go very dry. Some of these are lush looking at, but a lot, like the last one was the guy from Cal Flora, the gentleman who owns or owned it. And that's my local one, which means you're in a very moist area. But areas that go very dry, some of these structures can make a big difference. You have the winding pathways, you have, interesting shapes along the woody foliage. You've got some really good grasses that'll keep structure even when you don't have things that are in bloom or that feel as spring or winter lush.
Yeah, that's a great point.
One of the things I want to point out, I use this photograph to illustrate permeability, how the pathway is stepping stones nestled into gravel. And that helps permeability of rainwater getting back into the soil. Too often people, they have a pathway through their garden, they pave it completely. And I think it's important that we allow, as I said earlier, any rain we do get on our rooftops, we need to put it back into our local soil wherever possible. So I think, and by not having a paved pathway, I think it's an important consideration.
Back to that quail bush or salt bush.
Yeah,
Atriplex.
I was stunned when I'd never seen this plant. I think I'd seen it in the wild, but very scraggly. And here in a garden that's been maintained and cared for, it makes such a statement. It's a garden I only saw one time on one of my projects when I was specifically wanting native plant gardens to shoot, and I never saw this garden again. And I would love to see it, to see how it's evolved, because I don't think the quail bush is being as long lived as, for say, the ceanothus. But I don't know. I'd love to hear other history. I've planted 2 of them now. I have a native plant hedgerow that I planted next to my property, and I planted 2 of these because I just love the silver. And I don't know if they're going to be long lived, but I just they're fantastic.
And where is this garden?
Long Beach.
Long Beach. Beautiful. Yeah, the combination of the silver leaves with the ceanothus is really incredible. And the daffodils.
So nicely. And you'd mentioned that, you've seen this in the wild, but one of the things that makes it so beautiful in this garden is that, and that makes, the summer dry gardens not look as dry or weedy as we sometimes get complaints on. It is some, balancing with some of these pieces that we can trim and, prune as needed to keep them looking, appropriate for a lawn, for our front yard, from our backyard, whatever we're doing in that area. So this is a nice option that bringing it in and having it play off of some of the other colors.
Yeah, I think silvers can play off every color. They're so, there are whole garden books done on silver foliage, and I'm particularly drawn to them.
All right, we could talk about these gardens all day, but I'm keeping us on schedule. We have this beautiful meadow. Do you want to talk a little bit about this, Saxon?
Yeah, this is San Francisco Botanical Garden. This is the Menzies Native Plant Garden. This is actually a photo from at least 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. It's been, honestly, radically revised recently. It's going under regeneration in the past couple of years with some new garden plants in it. But what's important about it as a design is the swale, the depression, the way the water is allowed to travel through this garden. So the wetter areas, you see the meadow foam in the wet part down below where the rocks are placed. And it's a lot of matrix of various meadow grasses on the right. And beyond it, it's at least one native oak. I can't remember. There's some ceanothus and things in the back as the background. I find when I photographed botanic gardens, I try to find an angle that might be relevant to someone who sees it. And here, I think one could imagine that your house could be where the oak trees are. In this garden, it continues beyond. It's, those of you who know this area, it's a botanic garden. It's huge. But you could imagine how this might work in your own front yard. My earlier presentation, I showed that rain garden coming off a roof that was in a Woodland Hills garden. And that garden was fairly young. And you could probably tell the plants were still fairly young. But in 5 years, perhaps, that garden could knit together to be something like this. If I was standing on the street and the house was where those oak trees were, and the rain garden came off the gutters, and I channeled it to this depression, this low spot in my front yard, it would absorb the water. It would become a swale, and then it will allow deeper rooted plants to grow around it. So I think even though it's a botanic garden, I think the lesson is clear, what one could do. I think I actually used this in the Meadow book, but it's if you don't know the Menzies Garden in San Francisco Botanic Garden, it's one of the, it's really a great example of what can be done with native plants, except it is San Francisco. And I said earlier, it's like a subtropical cloud forest. It's not really like most of California because it gets fog in the summer. Evapotranspiration is not nearly the issue it would be if you're in the valley. And of course, it's wetter in the winter than most places, but it's but we do, we do realize most of our population in California is right along the coast. That's changing as we develop more interior, but there's with so many developments are within a few miles of the coast that this is the garden that's well adapted to that.
Well, and didn't you have an earlier book on meadows?
Yeah, the American Meadow Garden. Yeah, that was, I don't know if that was in that particular book, but I love meadows. So that's a recurring love of my own is grasses and meadows. This is a garden in Orinda, in the Bay Area people call over the hill. If you're on the west side of the Oakland Hills, it's much more temperate, more fog laden. Once you get on the east side of the hills, it's much hotter. So when you describe gardens in Northern California as east of the hills, you get in this garden, which is in Orinda, using native Muhlenbergia, the native sage, two sages, the white sage and the hummingbird sage. There's some iris leaves you see between the grasses. And I love being able to see the hills in the distance. So it gets us the setting of the house.
Beautiful.
Well, and it's definitely a hot, dry area there. So they needed to pull things that would handle that heat, that would handle a lot of direct sun.
Right.
That would not be having a lot of water added during the summer dry months.
Yeah, as I recall, I think this garden is not watered at all in the summer. This, of course, when it was young, I'm sure it had to be watered, but I'm pretty sure it's not watered in the summer. You see behind it some native oaks, which is, I'm looking to the west. So those oak trees would shield this border from the hot late afternoon sun. So it wouldn't quite be as hot as if it was without those trees. That's another great thing about trees. We talked about the ecosystem services they perform, but they obviously give you shade. But in a garden, they provide a whole different habitat for plants to grow under. So many of my favorite shrubs in my own garden are deciduous native shrubs that grow under the high oak trees. You couldn't grow unless I had oak trees.
And oak trees have been one of the hardest hit in the burns and tend to, with normal burn periods, tend to come back really well. Some of the later ones, we may need to re-oak a lot of areas, but they can be a really persistent piece of the vegetation.
So I want to zoom through these kind of quickly, unfortunately, but I think maybe just touching on some quick highlights, maybe if we just want to say, Saxon, maybe just say one thing that really draws you.
Well, the thing here, this heuchera is called windy. It's one of the things that there are a lot of heucheras that are corbels that are being developed through nurseries and native plant sales. And it's important that as a gardener, you know which one works for you, which ones are tall, which ones are spreading, and which ones take your conditions. And here's one that's windy, is just perfect for this location.
Yeah.
Where is it?
This is Santa Barbara.
Okay. The heuchera garden is in Santa Barbara.
This garden's in Santa Barbara, yes.
Okay.
Carol Bornstein designed it.
Beautiful.
This looks like that house with the oaks and
the same house. Yeah, it's the same house with their mix of Carex progressilis and Carex panza, a mixture of Carex, of sedges for lawn replacement. And the lawn is there. I think I use this in the book to talk about fire prevention and how you don't want your gardens growing right up to the house, and you can keep something like sedges fairly well hydrated and looking green with a minimal amount of water. They're really, really tough.
Lovely place to have spent some time.
Yes.
Oh, and this is charming.
This is that same garden. What you see the heucheras in the right?
Oh,
it's
yeah.
the same garden.
Yes,
Yeah.
cool.
It's a front yard garden. One Carol Bornstein, I hope all of you know, is the great native plant designer. Uh, Designed this years ago. It's an old photograph, but I like it. I talk about this as a curb appeal garden because they put the rustic split rail fence right by the sidewalk, and created this sort of sense of entry that's a native plant garden.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I love all the silver foliage,
Yeah.
different types of silver too. I mean, just different tones.
And a lot of things, again, that could take a direct sun and some summer heat.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Winding pathways again. It seems to be a theme.
Yeah, well, this homeowner was blessed by the oak trees, and so the designer came in and I was able to add various heucheras that I think is rosata. I think it's a very shade tolerant heuchera underneath it, and then built the pathway as a winding way from the street. This is a large property. I think this at least an acre, maybe an acre and a half, and blessed with these large oak trees. So, but
Where
high.
is this?
This garden is, I think, San Jose. I think it's a San Jose area.
Oh, wow.
Beautiful.
Love that coffee berry that's pruned. That's amazing.
Oh, this one I love. It's a tiny little garden. It's in Oakland. It's a tiny little garden, and I love the say the pruned coffee berry. There's a ceanothus behind it. It's pruned up to give it more light, so they can see the garden. As you can see, a tiny garden. From the house to the street. It's not more than 25, 30 feet. And there's a Phacelia, sort of, I think it's a blue Phacelia weaving through there. Can't be sure, but I like to point out the ceanothus on the left is mounded up, as is the coffee berry. They're both mounded up to give them good drainage. I think, especially in a small space, there would be a lot of root competition over time, but mounding it up and giving its own little mound to work with contributes to its health.
Oh, wow. Oh, well, we made it.
Oh,
Well, we'll just give a quick kind of run through of these points here, and then Saxon, are you okay staying on just for a couple more minutes?
oh, sure, I'm here. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I want to make sure everyone knows before they sign off that you can purchase the book at summerdry.com here through this URL, and there's a kind of convenient link there with an image of the book that you can use to purchase it. And you can also buy native plants, and we have some upcoming chapter plant sales that we'll be posting on our events page, cnps.org/events. And also always support our partners. Saxon even mentioned a few: California Flora Nursery, there's Theodore Payne down in SoCal, lots and lots and lots. Tree of Life, just so many great partners that sell native plants. And you can look those up using calscape.org. There's a nursery section to look up all of our partners so you can find a native plant nursery near you. And the last thing I'll say about that is Calscape offers you an amazing way to find regionally appropriate native plants that are adapted for your climate. And you just enter your zip code or your address, and it will give you a list of native plants that should meet your needs. So really cool resource, and kind of goes in line with the theme of the Summer Dry book for sure. So Saxon, do you have anything you want to say before we turn it over to Q&A?
No, it's been fun. We're really quickly. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for being on, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll stay around for maybe 5 minutes of question and answer. If anybody wants to throw some questions at Saxon or the team here.
Well, there was a lot of talk about asking of different locations and flower types. And I think in your book, you're going to have a lot of that, probably.
A lot of flower types.
Of what type of plants and where the different photos were from.
Well, the book is mostly it's a plant book. It's like an encyclopedia. There are charts in the back for hot areas or shade and whatnot. It's not a design book, so it's not going to tell you how to get it's up to you to decide, I think, if you want a low plant or a tall plant to read the descriptions. And it's really an introduction. There's so many. You mentioned local native plants chapters often have plants that are ideally adapted to the local climates. The book is an idea book. It's a starting point. Those of us who might know the Sunset Western Garden book, which is a very comprehensive encyclopedia with lots of small type and lots of plants. Our book is larger type and lots of pictures. So the pictures are certainly identified all by botanic names and whatnot, but it's not, it's a companion to other resources.
Sorry.
So you can find a lot of particular ones on Cowscape, and there's a new garden designer as well available. And then Maya, I think, had a couple of questions.
Yeah, Susan has a great question about tips for photographing your garden during the dry summer, like in August or September. How do you get good photos when things might look a little crisp?
Well, the first, don't take a picture in the middle of the day. You'll never have success. So that's, just don't try. The light's much too harsh. The first hour or two of the day or the end of the day is the time to take the picture. And beyond that, it's take time to understand what you're seeing. You can't just walk out in the garden and take a picture. You need to be in the garden and have a feel for it and understand it and know what you're trying to say. If you like the grasses, or you like the trees, or you like the pathway, make that your photograph. Don't try to do everything with one photograph. Have a concept, have a story to tell, and do it in soft light.
Great, thank you.
Suggestions. We've got a bunch of questions that have come in, and I've seen a lot of chatter going through this on natives with firescaping or with fire safe. And it's a big topic. It's a little bit too much maybe to answer in 3 minutes. It sounds like something that we may need to have a talk set up on.
I just answered it with some CNPS resources and the Chaparral Institute about protecting your home. But a lot of folks are saying, it's not necessarily, every fire guide has a different opinion on what, species can work or what's fire resistant and what actually isn't. But, knowing where to place your plants and keeping your plants hydrated seem to be some of the most critical aspects in keeping your space fire resistant.
And we have Kern Hildebrand said it was so nice to see and hear you that you photographed their Walnut Creek hillside garden years ago.
Yeah. Hello, Kern.
It was a beautiful set of pictures to share and some great insights. Thank you for spending the time with us.
Yeah,
Oh, it's my pleasure. That's part of my, my job, my passion. I want people to understand native plants are beautiful. They can be beautiful in the garden, and not just beautiful for us. They're beautiful for the climate and for all creatures. That's how we need to be thinking about taking care of the earth, is not just what we think is beautiful, but what the earth thinks is beautiful.
Amazing.
Yeah, beautifully said.
Oh, thanks. Great to be here.
Thanks
All right.
again.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending. Thank you again, Saxon. And we'll see you on the next Naturehood webinar.
Yay, thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody.